on to the ear. So the second sensory structure that is located in the head is the ear. And we'll talk about the ear in 3 parts. So there are 3 parts to the ear: external, middle, and inner ear. And as we can imagine, or as we should know, the function of the ear is for us to amplify vibrations and convert those ear vibrations into vibrations of fluid, which are in the inner ear. And then that is translated into action potentials, which are observed or understood or perceived as sound, depending on where it's appreciated in the brain. Okay, so very similar to what we saw with the eye, we've got a cranial nerve here, the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8, that is taking the sensory information in from the world around us, translating that into action potentials, which are then sent to the relevant parts of the brain and perceived as sound. So in terms of an overview of sound, sound enters or is trapped from our environment via the auricle or the pinna. This is sometimes called the outer ear or the external ear. It's trapped into the auditory canal or the ear canal. It's taken into the middle ear where it is amplified. So I'll talk about the 3 bones that are found in the middle ear that amplify sound, make it more amplified or more meaningful. And then those amplified sound waves are then transmitted into the inner ear, where they are translated into a vibration of fluid that is located in the inner ear. And then that is perceived onto the nerves as sound. So we go from the external ear to the middle ear to the inner ear. And we'll talk about each of those areas separately. So the external ear has the auricle or the pinna, that is the movable part of the ear or the outer ear. And that is what is important for trapping sound waves, right? Trapping the vibrations. So all of the sounds we hear, from music to voices to sounds of surfaces, whispers to really loud sounds, all of that is trapped as simply waves of sound, okay? They enter the external acoustic meatus, also called the external auditory meatus, which communicates from the outer ear into the middle ear. And then the boundary between the external ear and the middle ear is actually the tympanic membrane, also called the eardrum. And the eardrum is also serving to amplify those vibrations as they are trapped from the environment. So the external ear really comprises of the auricle or the pinna, and then the external auditory meatus or the auditory canal. Once we enter the middle ear, we encounter the ossicles. So there are 3 tiny bones within the middle ear, within the tympanic cavity, which is what the middle ear is also called, that are really small, but they have a really important role. So they are connected to the eardrum or the tympanic cavity, and they pick up the vibrations that are coming from the eardrum, and they are touching one another. So the malleus, which is the first ear ossicle or auditory ossicle, is connected to the encased, which is the second ear ossicle, is connected to the stapes, which is the third ear ossicle. And so they pass the vibration along from the tympanic cavity, which is coming from the external ear, to the round window, which is the connection to the inner ear, okay? I also want to point out here that these ossicles have alternate names because of the shapes of these bones. The malleus is sometimes called a hammer, the incus is sometimes called the anvil, and the stapes is sometimes called a stirrup, again, according to the shape of these bones. But the main purpose here is to take the sound, amplify it, and pass it on into the inner ear. The other important structure that's found in the middle ear or found in the tympanic cavity, so this entire region is called the tympanic cavity, is the eustachian tube, also called the pharyngotympanic tube, also called the auditory tube. And this is the ear-throat connection. So if you've ever had an ear infection, which can be really annoying, or if you've ever had a muffled sound, or if you've been on a long flight, as the flight begins to descend, you feel that blocked sensation in your ears, that is attributed to the pharyngotympanic tube, which connects into the pharynx, or the oropharynx, and that is the ear-throat connection, which really serves to equalize the pressure outside the ear and the pressure that is in the middle ear, or the tympanic cavity. Okay. Let's move on to the inner ear. And the inner ear is sometimes referred to as the labyrinth, or the bony labyrinth. And this is basically a complex sequence of structures that are wrapped up in bone that help to further amplify that sound. So we talked about the ossicles helping to raise the vibration, or helping to amplify the vibrations of those sound waves that are coming in. Now, when we get to the inner ear, those vibrations of ear are transmitted to vibrations of fluid, because the structures here in the labyrinth, in the inner ear, are actually fluid-filled structures. So let's talk about them one by one. So the connection from the stapes to the labyrinth happens via the oval window. So the stapes is pressed right up against the oval window, and the oval window communicates to the round window as well, which takes sound from the middle ear into the inner ear. And then in the inner ear, we've got three structures. We've got the semicircular canals, which are these rounded structures on top of the labyrinth. We've got the vestibule, which is at the base here of the labyrinth. And then we've got the cochlea. So the cochlea, which is this kind of snail or shell-like appearing structure, is what is responsible for the perception of sound, whereas the semicircular canals and the vestibule are responsible for our vestibular function and our balance. And together, both of these sensory perceptions are translated onto the vestibular cochlear nerve and taken to respective parts of the brain. Hence the term vestibular cochlear nerve, right? Part of that is balance, or the vestibular structure. Part of that is hearing, or the cochlea. So let's take a deeper look inside of the cochlea. So the cochlea is this kind of snail shell looking structure, right? The spiral looking structure. Inside the cochlea, we have three fluid-filled chambers. We've got the scala vestibuli on top. We've got the scala media, which is the important chamber here. And then we've got the scala tympani, which is on the bottom. Now, inside the scala media is where we've got the important structures for perceiving sound. So we'll take a look at the middle chamber, which is called the scala media, also called the cochlear duct, and look at the structures that are found there. So this is a more zoomed in view of the scala media. And the two important structures that are found here are the tectorial membrane. Okay, the tectorial membrane on top, and then we've also got the basilar membrane, which is on the bottom. And along the surface of these structures, we've got these hear cells. And so the way that hearing is perceived is different sounds will vibrate the fluid that is found either closer to the tectorial membrane or closer to the basilar membrane, depending on the pitch of that sound. So if I'm appreciating a really high-pitched sound, like the siren of an ambulance, the hairs that are closer to the basilar membrane are going to vibrate, and my brain, via the vestibular cochlear nerve, is going to perceive that as a high-pitched sound. Whereas if I am perceiving a more dull or a more low-pitched sound, let's say the bass of an instrument or the bass of a piece of music, I am going to perceive that as a lower pitched sound, because the hair cells that are vibrating closer to the tectorial membrane are going to indicate that difference in pitch. So we've got different hair cells that are located at different parts of the scala media. from the tectorial membrane to the basilar membrane that are indicating the differences in the frequencies depending on how, depending on which of the hair cells resonate. We also want to point out here the organ of Corti, sometimes called the spiral organ. And this is the structure underneath that is coming in contact with these hair cells and picking up these action potentials and translating that to the cochlear nerve. And the cochlear nerve is going to be just the cochlear component of the vestibular cochlear nerve, which is perceiving sound. Okay. Let's talk about the semicircular canal. So this is really the part of the labyrinth that controls our balance. And this is done via head rotation. This is going to tell us about our vestibular function, which is basically where we are in space, whether we're looking left, right, whether we're looking up, down. All of that is controlled by the semicircular canals and the vestibule, which are the other two parts of the labyrinth. So we've got 3 fluid-filled canals, which are enlarged in the semicircular canals. We've got the ampulla, and inside the ampulla, we've got the capula. So we can see here this bulge at the base of the semicircular canals. So these are the canals. And at the base of these canals, we've got these two structures that I'm going to talk about here. So the ampulla outside, and if we go inside the ampulla, we can see the smaller capula. And again, the same scenario, the same sort of apparatus that I talked about earlier with the hair cells and the fluid is what controls our appreciation of turning our head left, turning our head right. So if the hair cells, if we turn our head left, the hair cells will rotate in one way. If we turn our head to the opposite direction, the hair cells will rotate by flipping in the opposite direction. And that is what allows us to appreciate our spatial awareness of where we are in space, whether we're turning left, right, and then in the case of the saccule and utricle, whether we're looking up and down. So the saccule and utricle are the other two components of the labyrinth here. So we've got the saccule, which is the cut surface shown here, and then the utricle, which is the cut surface, and then the saccule. And again, very similar scenario here. We've got these hair cells that are found in these structures. And so when I tilt my head forward, the hair cells bend in one direction. When I tilt my head backwards, the hair cells bend in the opposite direction. And those that information is transmitted to the vestibular component of the vestibular cochlear nerve and tells me about my vestibular function, about my balance and spatial awareness. Okay. All right. So here's a different view of the saccule and utricle. So we can see the utricle here. Not to be confused with the base of the semicircular canals where we have the ampulla and capula. This is really the bottom, sort of beneath the semicircular canals altogether. And then we see the saccule here, which is also a part of that structure. And then for reference, we've got the cochlea, we've got the semicircular canals, and then we've got the cochlear component of the vestibular cochlear nerve and the vestibular component of that nerve, which together form the vestibular cochlear nerve.